I told Alvain I'm hesitant to speak to that, to lecture South Africans about South African church life. I don't know enough about South Africa or the church here to really comment much on that with any intelligence. But in conversation with Alvain and Ati Lo the other night, I spoke to them about one of my favorite thinkers and writers, and presented a little bit of one of his basic paradigms for thinking through any number of issues. And it seemed to be, Alvain and Adi seemed to think it would be a helpful thing to summarize for you. The name of the author is Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy was, I'll give you a brief, he's not a well-known figure in any country. There's a small band of loyalists, mostly in the United States, some in the Netherlands actually, and in other countries. He was a German-born historian and thinker, writer. It's hard to classify him. His training was in legal history. He knew and had studied everything. He had studied Egyptian hieroglyphics as a boy. One of the stories was that he gave his sister some kind of book written in hieroglyphics, I think, for a birthday present one year when he was 10 years old or something. He was a precocious child and a polymath. He had studied everything. He spent the first several decades of his life in Germany and as a German academic teaching legal history and other topics. He left Germany as soon as Hitler was elected in 1933. He had fought in the First World War and lived through the aftermath of the First World War. He saw some of the trends of post-World War I Germany between the wars and saw where things were going, and he realized when Hitler was elected, or he felt that when Hitler was elected that he had nothing to offer to a Germany that was under Hitler's control. He saw disaster coming, and he didn't think he had anything more he could do to try to avoid it. So he came to the United States and spent the rest of his life in the United States. Initially, he ended up at Harvard teaching. He was teaching in different departments. They didn't quite know what to do with him. He was qualified by his training and by his expertise to teach in several different departments at Harvard. But he kept talking about God, so they put him in the divinity school. He was not a theologian by training, and he never professed to have a specific vocation as a theologian. But he was a Christian, and his Christianity deeply influenced everything that he taught. So they put him in the divinity school. That was very bad fit for him, and so he ended up going to. I forgot this the other night too, and I didn't look it up. I can't. It's an Ivy League school in Vermont. I don't remember the. It's coming to me, but it'll come to me. He taught from the late 30s through the end of his life in the mid to late 60s. Taught at this Ivy League school in Vermont. His name I forget. I think you would recognize it if I could think of the name. That was more of a fit. He taught in lots of different subjects. He taught comparative religions. He taught history of religions. He taught some just general history courses. Wrote a number of books. The largest of them, and probably the most characteristic, is a book called Out of Revolution, which is calls it the autobiography of Western man, where he's tracing the history of the development of Western civilization by going through a number of revolutionary moments in the history of the West. And he looks at the Papal Revolution in the Middle Ages. He looks at the Reformation as a revolutionary moment. He looks at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and a couple other revolutions that I'm forgetting at this point. But he shows how all of those were transforming events in the history of the West. And the West is the product of these various revolutionary moments. Dartmouth, yes, of course, Dartmouth. I was getting the D. That was the only thing that was coming to me. Dartmouth. Dartmouth College was the Ivy League school where he taught for many years. Thank you. A fascinating character, and the other book that is well known is called The Christian Future. That's a study of contemporary America as it existed in the late 1940s when it was first published. I think it's still very relevant to at least the American scene today. But what I wanted to talk about was a basic paradigm that Rosenstock-Huessy uses to discuss virtually any topic that he's covering. He calls it the cross of reality. And when he uses the word cross, he means to imply the cross of Jesus Christ. He thinks Jesus is the center of history. He believed that Jesus was the center of history. He wanted to work out that truth, not just in some kind of spiritual way, but he thought that you could actually tell the story of history and see the impact of Jesus Christ and of the gospel and of the church in the history of humanity. He wanted to work out that in detail. So he wants to bring up that connotation of the cross of Jesus Christ, but he also wants to use this paradigm to explain not just what Jesus is about, but he wants to explain kind of all of reality and human experience using this paradigm. It's a very simple model. It's just a cross. Now, discuss. No, there's more to it. Okay. Human life is played out along two axes, Rosenstock-Huessy says. There's a temporal axis that's represented by the horizontal line. There's a spatial axis represented by the vertical line. The horizontal line moves between past and future. The vertical line is between the inside and the outside. I'll elaborate on this in various ways in a second, but the important thing for Rosenstock-Huessy is that human existence is lived out at the center of the cross. At the center of the cross, we're in between a past and a future. That means that we're in a place of pain, struggle, anguish, competing demands, competing obligations, competing legitimate obligations. We all have some kind of history, a national history, a religious history, a family history, a personal history. And we have obligations that arise from that history, from that past, that we cannot ignore. We can't just jettison the past. We're obligated to live in terms of that heritage. At the same time, we are called to a future that is different from the past. We have a calling to something new. And that means, because we're at the center of the cross, we're constantly pulled between the demands of our past, the demands of our heritage, the demands of family and nation, and the calling to do something new in the future. Okay? It's easy to, comparatively easy, to overcome the difficulty of that, of negotiating those different demands by moving to one or the other side of the spectrum. We can relieve the struggle of living between the past to which we are obligated and the future call that we have to answer. We can relieve that by just sliding over here and just retaining the past and living in the past and just staying in the same ruts that we've always been in. We can do that individually. We can do that as a church. We can do that as a nation. Rosenstock-Huessy says that's an abandonment of maturity and responsibility to live in this kind of nostalgic past. It's easier because we don't have to worry about this future demand, this future call. It's easier in that sense, but it's also not a way of maturity. It's a way to immaturity. We can also relieve the pressure and relieve the tension by sliding over this direction, just abandoning the past starting over, year zero, everything new, tear down all the old monuments. That's a revolutionary position. This is nostalgic, that's decadent, and that's immature. This is revolutionary, and that also is an act of immaturity. Maturity comes by staying at the center of the cross and trying to learn to, sometimes he uses the image of a dance. Sometimes we have to lean to the past and recover things that have been lost. Sometimes we have to let the past die so that we can do something new. But we can't simply slide to one or the other end of this temporal axis. We have to stay at the center of the cross, pulled in these different directions, which are making legitimate demands on us. And we can't abandon either one if we're going to grow in maturity. That means that we're going to live lives that are constantly under pressure, constantly being pulled in different directions. The vertical axis is a spatial axis between the inside and the outside. And this operates at a number of different levels. We can think of as at an individual level. We have certain aspirations, hopes, dreams they will want to realize that are inspired, coming from within. But then when we try to realize those dreams, we have to confront the world outside. We can live in our imaginary world of aspiration. Okay? We can stay on this upper side of the axis, but that we don't actually achieve anything. We don't actually grow. Because if we stay here, we don't, but moving out from here to here, or staying here, having those aspirations, but seeing them confront reality and sometimes being frustrated by reality, that's tough, that's hard, that's life on the cross. That can be a feeling of death. We have these dreams and then we hit the hard realities of the world outside and our dreams seem to be crushed. How do we negotiate that? We can't negotiate that just by living in a dream world. Rose, like you see, does not think either that we should forget about our dreams and aspirations and not be inspired by those. We have to negotiate between the two. We have to struggle and remain on the cross between those two demands. This axis, the spatial axis, could also be in terms of groups. You have an in-group and you have an out-group. You've got your family. But a family becomes ingrown, decadent, and immature unless it opens out to hospitably receive something from outside. Unless it moves out and seeks to contact the world outside of the family, it's not healthy. A family that's just closed in on itself is not a healthy family. A family that just disperses, a family that never has any inside experience, a family that never gathers at a table, as I mentioned earlier. A family that's always in different places, going in different directions. That's also not a healthy family. But trying to maintain both, trying to maintain the internal health of the family, and also recognizing that there's things to receive from outside, and there are things to achieve on the outside of the family, and there's a kind of mission that's built into the family. Trying to bring those together is difficult. Rose Sakusi does not think of this as a matter of balance. It's not balancing the inside and the outside. Balance is too placid and calm a metaphor for him. He thinks we have to recognize that this is a painful place to be. It's painful to be pulled in these different directions and to have that experience. You can have an in-group and an out-group in terms of a national group or church. I mean, you can have an ingrown church that has no mission. You can have an outwardly directed church that's evangelistic and mission-oriented, but doesn't have much to share because there's no life within. Okay, you can have church members who are always pushing you to go evangelism, go on mission. And you have church members that say, no, we've got to build up the communal life of the church. Which one you're going to do? What you're going to choose? You can't choose either one by itself because that's not a healthy church. A church that has a mission without any communal life is not a healthy church. A church with communal life without any mission is not fulfilling the purpose of the church. But trying to have both of those in the same church is very difficult. Those of you who are pastors might have experienced the tensions and the pull of different sorts of members in your church, who have different visions of what the church should be, and trying to harmonize those. You're put on the cross because you have to lead a church that's both moving out and also cultivating the life within. It applies to nations. A nation that is just a fortress nation that's closing itself off from all other nations is not a healthy, that's not a healthy situation. A nation that just clears out, that breaks down its walls, that doesn't have any sense of nationhood or peoplehood is also not a healthy nation. But trying to keep those two together puts you on the cross in this kind of tension. So Rosenstock-Huessy applies this simple paradigm to just about everything. If you read Rosenstock-Huessy, you'll find that he's constantly talking about, even when he's not referring directly to the cross, he's thinking in this fourfold pattern of past and future, inside and outside. For example, he talks about different forms of ancient civilization. There's tribal civilizations that's oriented to the past, preserving the past, pleasing the ancestors. The ancestors have spoken and you don't have any new decisions to make. You just do what the ancestors told you to do. When you have a festival, the ancestors show up, represented by the masks, and their eyes are really big because their eyes are watching you all the time. And they're watching for any deviation from ancestral tradition. Okay, that's what he calls a tribal order that's oriented to the past. He thinks of ancient imperial civilizations as civilizations that were directed outward, not just outward in conquering neighboring territories, but also outward in terms of attention to the sky. He points out that all the Babylonian and other temples were also observatories. They were guided by the sky. They're looking up to the heavens in order to know how to live on earth. He associates the in-group with the Greek city-state. The Greek city-state, which cultivates the internal life of the polis and achieves a kind of artistic and cultural achievement that was unprecedented at the time. And then there's a fourth kind of civilization in the ancient world, which is oriented to the future, which is Israel. It's a fourth kind of civilization, which is, it has tribal elements, but it's not quite a tribe. It has cities, but it's not quite a city-state. It has temples, but it's not quite an imperial power. And the thing that distinguishes Israel, he says, that it's oriented to the future fulfillment of God's promise. Okay, that's just another illustration of how this paradigm is used. The reason I brought this up the other evening in our conversation was thinking about the current situation in South Africa for the South African churches and for the Afrikaans Protestant Church in particular. I think this gives a paradigm. It doesn't answer the questions, but it does give a paradigm for thinking about what kinds of demands and pressures you're facing. And again, just close with this and then open it up for discussion, clarification, elaboration if you need it, and any kind of comments on how this might apply. The last thing I want to do is go back to my original point that Rosenstock-Huessy that thinks this is the place where we should be. We have to be around the center of the cross. Life involves suffering in being pulled in these various directions, and that's the way to maturity. That's the way to break out of old ways that we need to break out of and find new paths to follow. It's the way, to put it in more biblical terms, which Rosenstock-Huessy also uses. Staying at the center of the cross is the only way to die and rise again. Okay. You can avoid the death by just living in the past. You can leap over by trying to live a future revolutionary life. But dying and rising again only takes place by accepting the pressures and demands from both sides. And he would put this in Christian terms. that it's only in Christ, only in Jesus' death and resurrection, that we have the power to stay at the center of the cross and experience that personal, ecclesial, and cultural, national death and resurrection. So, is that paradigm, the picture diagram, clear enough for you to see the point? If you need clarification of what I've just said, please let me know.